Before this video starts, I want to make it super clear that I'm not against bioactivity, and this video is not meant to be anti-bioactivity or against anyone who uses it. I think it can be useful in some situations, and even myself, I have a bioactive leopard gecko enclosure, so I'm not against it. But that said, I'm not a hypocrite either. You'll see what I mean later. I'll explain my thoughts. This video is also meant to be more like philosophical and thought-provoking rather than like a factual care guide. So just hear me out, and if you disagree, that's fine. Just to be clear, I'm not against bioactivity. This thumbnail was like semi-clickbait. I mean, you'll see what I mean. So yeah, please enjoy. Alright, so in case you didn't know, there's this big bioactive trend on YouTube right now. It is currently the most searched reptile related topic on YouTube. So I want to address this because many people think this is their goal and this is the perfect way to keep their reptile, but I don't think this is always true. So in this video, I'll talk about the two perspectives of this, and also my own opinion and an explanation for my enclosure. So for this video, I'm going a bit less scripted, a bit more natural, just to experiment, and it might not do it as well, but we'll see how it goes. So, bioactive enclosures, they aim to mimic the animal's wild habitat, and they're very aesthetically pleasing, but they're not always necessarily best for our pets. So this video will explain why. So the first perspective is the natural way of keeping. This is the way that many people use. It is basically, you are basically trying to recreate your pet's natural habitat. I used to do this before I found out the other method, and an example is how I tried to recreate the salt range and the Himachal Pradesh for my leopard gecko. So the reason behind this is lizards, like all other living organisms, they evolve through natural selection. So when two animals reproduce, their offspring will have mutations in their genes. So then you have like a variety of different traits, and some of these traits will die because they just don't work in that environment, and some others will survive. So eventually all the living ones will be adapted to this environment, because otherwise it would be dead. Therefore, all animals are perfectly adapted to the environment or the natural habitat, because otherwise they would be dead. So the thought is that this applies to our pet reptiles. So if we give them like a recreation of their natural habitat, then they would be satisfied and they would be happy and they would thrive. A way to an analogy of this is if you imagine a tailor-made jacket that's made to fit a specific human being, and the jacket represents the lizards, which are like tailor-made to its environment sort of, and then the human body would represent its natural habitat. So if you put that jacket back on its human body, then it would fit because it was made for that human body. So that's the idea of this way of keeping. So in practice, what people try to do is recreate its natural habitat or its wild habitat. They do this by adding plants, a cleanup crew, natural soil, natural backgrounds, natural lighting, just to like copy what they have in the wild. minus some negative things. So for example, parasites, flood, drought, natural disasters. And this way of keeping is good because it looks very good, it's very satisfying, and to most reptile keepers this is the most moral way to do it because you're giving your pet what it's familiar with. So many people think doing this would mean that their pet is the happiest they could be, but there are cons. So this way of keeping is not really tailored to the specific individual because reptiles, like humans, have different personalities, and some have injuries or birth defects. So each individual is different. So if we give every single reptile the same care, then eventually some will be unsatisfied. And the other problem to this is sometimes we can't fully recreate its natural habitat, and this could lead to problems. So for example, leopard geckos in nature eat a lot of rodents, and rodents are quite high calorie, but that's fine in nature because they can wander around, they exercise a lot, and they can burn off those calories. But in captivity we have our leopard geckos in an enclosure, so it doesn't have that opportunity. So if we keep our captive leopard geckos as much rodents as they get in nature, in the wild, then they would become obese because our enclosure isn't a full copy of nature, and there are some things that are missing that you can never truly recreate. So therefore this creates a problem in our captive lizards, and this could apply to other things. For example, you can never have an enclosure as bright as they have in the wild just because it's very bright outside and LEDs just don't satisfy that. I explained that in my lighting video, you can check that out. And we don't know what this could lead to because sunlight has a lot of benefits and animals depend on sunlight. So if we can't even fully recreate that, then we don't know what problems that could produce if we start doing other things according to nature. So the incomplete recreation also causes problems. Many people, including me back then, thought that nature is perfect and it's created by God. So if we try to recreate this, then we can't really go wrong because we're following a perfect role model. But in my opinion, in reality, you can't really do this fully because you can't fully recreate nature. So, instead of trying to replicate the wild, I think we should focus more on giving our animal what it wants and needs. So this brings us to the other view, or the other perspective, which is welfare-based care. So a brief description of this method is you basically give your individual animal what it wants as long as it's safe, and this way is much more tailored and customized to the specific individual. If you want to learn more about this method, since this video is quite brief, you can check out Reptiles and Research's Patreon because he's got a welfare course there and it's very detailed, very philosophical, and much more in depth than I can explain. So the way you use this method in practice is through an experiment. So I'm going to simplify it for this video, but first you give an animal the choice of multiple options. So maybe you give it a plastic hide and a wood hide next to it, and after that you observe and you see what it prefers and you judge whether that is safe, and afterwards you give it to that animal. So the first step doesn't necessarily have to be inside the enclosure. You can have a plastic box with maybe 4 substrates, and you put your reptile in that box and see which it prefers. And after you record what it likes, you can incorporate that into your enclosure. But obviously it has to be safe and physically healthy for the animal. For example, bearded dragons really like strawberries, and leopard geckos really like eating waxworms, but those things aren't healthy if you give it to them in large quantity. So you do have to do the research behind each of these options. So an example of this is how I noticed my leopard gecko really likes his cork background, so I've added more of that to the other sides of his enclosure, and I'll probably add more sky hides or sky tunnels, just because I observed that he really likes to spend a lot of his time arboreally. I'm not sure if that's a word, but he does like to be quite high in his enclosure rather than on the substrate, and this could vary between individuals. So there could be leopard geckos who prefer laying on the substrate. Then you could maybe give it a bigger enclosure to, you know, use more of that and basically be happier. So, you know, as you can see, it's quite like customized. And this way of keeping also ignores whether something is natural or not, because animals don't, even in nature, they don't really care if something is like natural or man-made. So an example would be how leopard geckos would lay on tarmac like grounds in Pakistan after the sun sets, because tarmac it stays quite hot even after the sun sets. So it has the property that a leopard gecko likes. Even though it's not necessarily natural, the animal would seek it for its purpose. So if you use the same logic in an enclosure, you'll realize that natural or non-natural doesn't really matter as long as it's safe. Therefore, bioactivity isn't as important if you follow this way of keeping, and bioactivity isn't your goal because some animals would prefer not bioactive. So, for example, if you have a small gecko or an anole, or like in my case a leopard gecko, and its environment is quite complex, so it's quite hard to clean, and if you choose not to clean regularly, it could start suffering from diseases and things like that because it's not very hygienic. And also geckos quite like to eat insects, they like to hunt, and that makes them happy. So in that scenario, for the animals like physiological benefit, you would go bioactive because that's something the animal values and something that it likes. But on the opposite side, maybe you have an injured gecko and it can't hunt and climb as well. So in that case, you wouldn't go bioactive because that isn't really benefiting the individual. And you know, if you're forcing it to climb or hunt, then it would be in pain, and that's not good welfare. That's not a good way to live. So as I said, following this way of keeping means that bioactivity isn't your goal, and it can be used as a tool, but it's not it's not what you should be aiming for, at least according to this way of keeping. However, a counter argument made for this by JTB Reptiles is that he gave the analogy of a cacti, and cactuses need water to survive, and but they've evolved to live with like a small amount of water. So if in captivity we give them lots of water, even though that's what they like, they would suffer because they're not adapted to that in the wild. So both ways of keeping have their own pros and cons. So I'm gonna talk about my my view of this and like my way of keeping. So what I do, like my thought process is, first, if you imagine a painting, for the base coat layer I would use what's natural, because when you first make the enclosure you don't really have that much knowledge of what your animal likes, and after that you can start adding like the top layers, and you can start I would start doing all the experiments and seeing what my animal likes, and then start incorporating that into my enclosure. And if you think about it as a painting, you see the top layer more than you see the the base coat layer, and this also applies to my enclosure. You know, eventually when the whole process is done, you'll see more of what the animal likes than what is like wild like. But then for the things that is hard or you can't experiment with, those gaps would be filled by what's wild like. So this is my way of keeping. I try to use a bit of both methods, but I am leaning more towards the welfare side, because I just think if I was a lizard, I wouldn't really care if my enclosure is natural or not. I would just want to be happy and healthy, and that applies to me in real life as well, because I live in a house and I'm satisfied with that, even though a house isn't what our ancestors lived in. An analogy for this would be how if you force a vegan to eat meat, then the vegan wouldn't be happy, even though meat is what our ancestors ate and it's technically what's wild. But you know, because of our personalities and preferences, we would rather live a life without these things and choose what we'd actually prefer. So this is just my way of keeping. This is my opinion. You don't have to do the same thing. You can judge for yourselves. So last thing I'm going to talk about is I'm going to address why my enclosure looked so empty and not naturalistic back then. If you've seen my lighting video, you'll see lots of clips with like paper towel substrate and not a lot of clutter and things like that. So the explanation for this is, a while back I was planning on doing a full deep brumation, like with a fridge and stuff like that, but then I did a fecal exam and it came positive with a very small count of pinworm eggs, and I was just like stressing out because of this. So I took out all of the substrate on the cool side and a lot of the clutter and, you know, all the leaf litter, and I was just trying to make the whole enclosure a bit more sterile and easy to clean. But for the left side, the hardened clay is quite hard to remove, and my thought back then was it's under all that UV light and all that heat, so eggs shouldn't survive there. So that's why I did that. But looking back now, I've seen BeardieVet talk about why parasites are actually, you know, kind of beneficial to bearded dragons, and you know, he talked about why treating parasites until there's literally zero left could be like stressful for the body of an animal. And also he talks about how in the wild animals live with parasites and it's more of a symbiotic relationship than a parasitic relationship. He didn't exactly say this, I'm sort of paraphrasing this and, you know, adding a bit of my interpretation. So you should check his video. It's by Reptiles and Research, and it was a podcast with him, with BeardieVet, and I'll put a link in the description. It's a really good video. So yeah, he basically talks about how parasites are only harmful if they're in too much of a quantity in the animal system, and that's caused by the animals having a bad immune system, and that's another issue, maybe a husbandry issue. So yeah, basically he talks about basically in summary, parasites are safe as long as they're not in too high quantities and like out of control. By all means, if you have an animal that's showing symptoms and actually suffering from parasites, you should go see a vet or maybe treat it. But in my case, he showed no symptoms, he was healthy weight and he was acting normally as well. So that's why now I've switched back to a more like enriching way of keeping. So hopefully this video has made an impact. I don't know, I just feel like if you're a new keeper and you go on YouTube and you start seeing all these, you know, people like advertising, like saying how bioactivity is the best way to keep your animal, you might not necessarily be giving the best care for your pet. And yeah, like I said, it really depends on the situation. If you have a new reptile, then I probably wouldn't go bioactive, just because I would want to observe it more, you know, see if it's got any symptoms of diseases before I maybe think about going bioactive. So, you know, it's a lot more flexible doing it this way, and I just think bioactivity shouldn't be like a goal, if that makes sense. So thanks for watching. I hope you've learned something from this video. I'm pretty sure if you like this video, it'll help with the algorithm. I'm not too sure, but even if it doesn't, you know, just you watching this video would boost the algorithm so more people can see this. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching.